Good afternoon. I am at Greenup, Illinois, and just did something there to create a pop-up. But I am in revival at Greenup, Illinois, in Pilgrim Holiness Church, and was going to try to record this yesterday, but trying to get ready to come over here for revival was unable to do so. So today I am here, and we're going to try this, see if it will work. We're going to talk today about the Book of Ruth. Most of you know that I like my Speedway drinks. This is the closest thing to Speedway that I have, and I've got to get used to this camera. It's a Love's drink, so you'll see me sipping on it to keep me going. So I want to talk a little bit about Ruth, and one of the reasons why I'm doing Ruth here, let me start my timer, is the fact that I want to be there for some discussions for the book of Judges, which I think is crucial for us to understand in the day and age in which we live. And so Ruth is a little bit easier, although there is a lot of things I would like to discuss with the book of Ruth. It is a fascinating little book, and I have even found some very fascinating things as I have been reading through it, as I challenge you to read through it. Listen to these books as you're having your devotions will really help you. And so I want to delve right in. I don't have a lot of time. I have a supper engagement with the pastor and pastor's wife at 4:30. And at present, it is 2:16 here in Illinois, 3:16 in Indiana time. So I'm an hour behind you. So let's get started and look at some things here out of the book of Ruth. Introducing the book of Ruth, Bruce Wilkinson and Kenneth Boa gives this about the book of Ruth, and let me read this to you. The short story of Ruth is one of the beautiful love stories of the Bible. Boaz, a type of Christ the Redeemer, woos and marries Ruth, a type of Christ's church. The events took place in the days when the judges governed. In chapter 9, it was shown that this is in Judges. In chapter 9 of Judges, it was shown that the period of Judges, extending from about 1375 BC to about 1050 BC, was mainly one of apostasy, unrest, wars, and judgments. But there was temporary periods of deliverance and peace from the harassment of the enemies. The book of Ruth relates one of the stories of the brighter years, reminding us, among other things, that all was not black darkness during those years. The account of a godly family, and let me just pause to say this, there are those that would question whether Elimelech and Naomi was a godly family by leaving Bethlehem, but the account of a godly family, and I'm quoting here from Bethlehem, reveals something of God's mysteries and wonderful ways of sovereign grace in fulfilling his divine purposes through a believing remnant. Ruth is a cameo story of love, devotion, and redemption set in the black context of the days of the judges. It is the story of a Moabite woman who forsakes her pagan heritage, and that is key in this story of Ruth. She forsakes her pagan heritage in order to cling to the people of Israel and to the God of Israel. Because of her faithfulness in a time of national faithlessness, God rewards her by giving her a new husband, Boaz, a son, Obed, and a privileged position in the lineage of David and Christ. If you remember, she is the great-grandmother of David. Our textbook, Victor Hamilton's Handbook on Historical Books, gives this. If the New Testament has its parable of the Good Samaritan, recorded only in Luke chapter 10, the Old Testament has its parallel, the story of the good Moabite. Few Judeans in Jesus' day ever thought of any Samaritan as good. Similarly, the first adjective that would have come to the mind of an Israelite who thought Moabite, more than likely, was not good. The story of Ruth is a great example of God's love for his people, even when they make bad choices. We see the Israelite family that decides to go to Moab to avoid a famine. In spite of not trusting God, God uses their time in Moab to introduce them to a young Moabite girl who wanted a change in her life. God honored Ruth's desire for something better, and she is included in the lineage of David and of Jesus Christ. The chronological study Bible introduces Ruth, and I just moved to another one and didn't realize I didn't include this one in on the list. But the book of Judges, like many histories, the chronological study Bible writes, presents only the wars and battles of its time. The book of Ruth deals with what average people were doing between those wars. It describes a stable society governed by wise elders in which the laws of the covenant are respected and kept. For instance, the law demanded that if a man died before his wife gave birth to him, or gave birth to a child to him, the nearest male relative was to marry this widow and raise up a child for the dead. Under this law, eventually Ruth marries Boaz. The book also pictures more peaceful relationship than does the book of Judges, which we will look at next week. Naomi moves back and forth between the country of Israel and Moab without much trouble at all. Her sons, Chilion and Mahlon, marry Moabite women. This intermarrying alone is surprising, but even more startling is that this mixed marriage of Ruth and Boaz is blessed of God and produces Israel's greatest king, King David. To show us again how important this book really is to the Jewish people and as well to the Gentile people of today, let me illustrate by giving you several summaries of people that are talking about the book of Ruth. I have just a little summary quote of Dr. Chuck Missler that where he says, in many respects, Ruth is the ultimate love story. It's a love story on several levels. It's a love story because Ruth falls in love with Boaz. And that is the main plot line of this whole story. But overlaying Ruth's falling in love with Boaz and that wonderful love story is another love story that this book greatly alludes to. And that is our great Redeemer, Jesus Christ, that loved us so much that he died on a wooden cross over 2,000 years ago. Alex Verghese says this: the book of Ruth is among one of the finest and best loved short stories in the Old Testament. Characters such as Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz are some of the most colorful in the Bible. The book is appropriately named after the central character of the story, although we do not know who actually wrote the Book of Ruth. We'll get to that a little bit later. The story avoids reference to strife and war and is concerned instead with normal human existence and basic human emotions, writes L. Thomas Holdcroft. It becomes clear that even though the era of the judges was one of much warfare and chaos, yet in many communities there was long periods when life continued peacefully and normally. The book of Ruth is special in several reasons, and some of these I've entitled it on the PowerPoint as interesting facts from the Book of Ruth. Number one, it is read by the Jewish people, by a rabbi, at the Feast of Pentecost. Now, originally this was called the Feast of Weeks, but became known as the Feast of Pentecost. And this feast celebrates the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. This is rather interesting that it's celebrating the law, and the Book of Ruth is read that talks about Gentile woman. Quite interesting when you look at it there. It also is important to the church, and it shows the modern church that Jesus is our ultimate Redeemer. It is also interesting to note that this book is read on the feast day, the Feast of Pentecost, of which the church was founded. The Holy Spirit indwelling the people on the day of Pentecost was the beginning, was the founding of the modern church as we know it today. And so it's quite interesting as we study this particular book. All right, let's look at the background. And again, your overview chart for the Book of Ruth. And let me just mention here, and I'll mention it next week in class, but I would like to have, by the 1st of October, I would like to have your overview charts turned in for Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. And so if you can be preparing that, the information that I'm going to give you goes on this chart. So in all reality, I'm doing a lot of the work for you by these PowerPoints. And by the way, I will have my notes and the PowerPoints uploaded onto Populi as well as this video. The author of the Book of Ruth is unknown. Nowhere in the Book of Ruth, or really, for that matter of fact, nowhere in the Bible is it mentioned who writes the Book of Ruth. Some have suggested Samuel was the writer of the Book of Ruth. However, yes, Samuel knew David. Samuel anointed David as king. But Samuel died before David ever became king. If you remember the story, and we will get to this later on, but if you remember the story of King Saul, before King Saul died in battle, the night before, he visited the witch of Endor. And he wanted to resurrect someone to ask a question. Who does he have resurrected from the dead, so to speak? It's not really the resurrection like we talk about it, but in a seance, in a satanic type of a way, the prophet Samuel rises and talks to King Saul. Samuel was dead. So there's no way that Samuel could have written this book to really explain what all was happening. And some believe that it was written during the kingship of King David to validate that his lineage. Some say it was written during the reign of Solomon. We really don't know who wrote the Book of Ruth, and can I say it this way? We really don't care, because it doesn't take anything away from this sweet little book that's lovely, and it's a spiritual book. The date of the writing, depending on um, what you give, um, the the date of the writing of the book. Now, this is not exactly when the book was written, but the book covers somewhere between 1373 to 1050 BC. This was the time, as I've already mentioned, of the judges. Many scholars believe that Ruth lived, and the story of Ruth took place during the judge Gideon's time, which, to the best of my ability, knowledge, is around 1147 BC. So this story took place at 1147 BC. The writing of it was later on in the kingdoms. And let me just mention the setting of the book of Ruth. The setting and the geography of the book of Ruth would be in Bethlehem to Moab, back to Bethlehem. And that back to Bethlehem part would entail the harvest of barley at that particular time. This is the setting. So Elimelech and Naomi and their sons are in Bethlehem. There's a famine. He leaves and goes to Moab. He stays in Moab for about 10 years, and then he dies. His two sons die, and Naomi hears that God has ended the famine and brought harvest to Bethlehem. She is now an alien in Moab. Her husband's not there. Her sons are not there. All that she has to her name is two daughter-in-laws, and Naomi goes back to Bethlehem. But in all reality, when she goes back to Bethlehem, she tells the people that God has dealt very harshly with her. And she said, I went out full and I come back empty. I went out happy and I come back bitter. And so this is the setting of the book of Ruth. The theme of the book of Ruth is one that Ruth serves as an illustration of the righteousness that was still alive in some places in Israel during the time of the judges. And this is important because when you look at the time of the judges, let me get our textbook because it deals with this a little bit here. Let's see if I can find it here. Basically, Ruth fits very well at the end of Judges. The last two stories in the book of Judges, as we will see next week, deal with two Benjamite people. We have the Benjamite Levite that goes to the tribe of Dan and commits idolatry. Actually, not with Dan, but Dan's tribe comes and takes over that area, and he becomes their priest. The other one is of a Benjaminite concubine of another person. Happens to be another Levi, but he's not from Benjamin or Bethlehem. And so you have the Bethlehemite concubine who he gives to the people of the town that are wanting to abuse him in an immoral homosexual way, and he gives his concubine, which they abuse her until the next morning she is dead. He chops her body up into 12 parts and sends them to the tribes and tells of the atrocity that was done. The third story, which happens to be in the book of Ruth, is a positive to those very two negative stories that end the book of Judges. Ruth is a very positive story, and so it illustrates righteousness to unrighteousness. The theme of Ruth is redemption. And that is the main theme. The purpose, Ruth provides a positive example of righteousness in contrast to the two examples of unrighteousness that ends the book of Judges. Ruth also teaches that Gentiles could believe in the true God. 3 out of the 4 women mentioned in Christ's genealogy in Matthew 1 were Gentiles: Tamar, Rahab, and Ruth. And if you take Bathsheba, who was a 4th one, though from Scripture it indicates that she was Jewish, yet she married a Hittite man, which would then disqualify her from being a true Jew or a true Israelite. So again, it's quite interesting there. Also, one of the purposes of Ruth is to introduce us to King David. Both 1 Samuel and Ruth introduces us to Israel's greatest king. Hamilton gives us this contrast between Ruth and 1 Samuel, and I like this, and I'm going to switch to well, I thought I was. There we go. I'll switch to this particular one. One of the purposes of Ruth is to introduce us to King David. Ruth gets us to David by a means of idyllic romance story featuring a Moabite heroine, and 1 Samuel gets us to David by means of a protracted struggle between Bishop Samuel and King Saul, and the latter's fall from grace. All right. I'm not sure. I'm trying to go from various ones here, but this is what I'm using, and you can sort of see here, if you can't in the other one, you can sort of see the little camper that I'm staying in. Very nice, and very thankful for that. All right, let's go back to the keys to the book. The key word for the book of Ruth is kinsman and redeemer. The key verses is found in Ruth chapter 1 verse 16, and this is where Ruth is saying to Naomi, entreat me not to leave thee or to return from following after thee, for whether thou goest, I will go, and whether thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Whether thou diest, I will die, and there I will be buried. And so it's that whole your people shall be my people speech that Ruth gives Naomi. And then also in Ruth chapter 3 and verse 11 is the second one. And now, my daughter, fear not, I will do to thee all that thou requirest, for all the city of my people doth know that thou art a virtuous woman. And we'll deal more with that, but that is a powerful, powerful testimony to Ruth. The key chapter is Ruth chapter 4, and this is the very end of the book, and this is where Boaz redeems and marries Ruth. The key people in the book of Ruth is Boaz and Naomi. All right, I'm just looking at my camera down here, and I'm not sure if it is exactly what's going on here. All right, let's get started. It's actually acting a little strange there, so I'm not sure what is going on here. So Christ is seen in the book of Ruth as the kinsman redeemer is a key thought in the portrayal of the work of Christ in Ruth. The messianic types are Ruth, who represents the church, the body of believers, and Boaz, who represents Christ in the kinsman redeemer. Contribution to the Bible, the book of Ruth contributes to the Bible in four ways. Literary, Ruth is a book of simplicity and profundity. It is one of literature's best example of filial love and piety. Historically, Ruth provides a bridge between the judges and the monarch. Its last word is David. It illustrates faithfulness amid infidelity. Doctrinally, Ruth teaches that the Gentiles are not outside the scope of redemption. Morally, Ruth communicates high ideals of integrity in relationships and marriage. Quite interesting there. Here is the outline, and again, I will have this on PowerPoint so that you can copy this to your overview charts if you are interested to do so. You do not have to. You can find another outline, is perfectly fine as well. So, before we delve into the chapter by chapter explanation survey of the book of Ruth, and I'm trying to time myself here, so let me see how long I have gone, or I have an hour and 20 minutes left if I'm going to do a little bit here. So let's see what happens. This may not be completely 2 hours, but let's see what happens anyway. So, three concepts that, as we get ready to go through the book of Ruth, that you need to know and need to understand before we get into the book of Ruth. So let me go into it. The law of the Redeemer. The Hebrew word for close relative or redeemer is goel, G-O, and a marking E-L. It's translated close relative and can mean to redeem. Such relatives were redeemers because they had a legal obligation under the law of Moses to redeem or buy back the property of destitute relatives from foreclosure. A close relative could redeem through monetary payment. They redeem two different ways. One monetary, the other one is not monetary. So through monetary means, you could buy back land and homes. You could buy back an indentured servant. Sometimes the Israelites would give themselves up as slaves for a time being to pay a debt. And so you had that, and a nearer kinsman could buy you back and take you out of being a slave. The third one is a religious offering. You could actually buy back the offering and redeem the offering. The non-monetary redeemer was one that if a relative was murdered, he would become what is known in the Old Testament as the avenger of blood. He would seek after the killer and would avenge the blood. It was an eye for an eye, a life for a life. And so if someone took, and I'm going to pick on Logan here, if Logan took my daughter's life, then as the father, I would be the avenger of blood. I would come, and it was my obligation to kill Logan to avenge the blood of my daughter. I know that doesn't sound whatever in our modern thinking, but that was how it was. The next law that we want to look at, and I hope I'm saying this word right. I was going to check it online before I started this and had trouble getting everything set up and completely forgot to check on it. So I will check on it afterwards and see what happens here. But it's called the law of the Levirate, the Levirate marriage. Levirate. Levar is the Latin word for brother-in-law. So therefore, the Levirate marriage is described in the legal text of Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 through 10. If a man died without leaving a male heir, His widow was to marry within the husband's family. Moreover, the husband's brother, or the widow's brother-in-law, was required to perform the duty of the brother-in-law and to marry the woman and produce a son. Now, we're going to see in this story that if a man chooses not to fulfill this law of a brother-in-law marriage, he was looked upon with shame and disgrace. The nearer of kinsmen was willing to be the redeemer of the land of Naomi's. When he found out that it involved Ruth, he wasn't so as excited about redeeming. And so you have here that they were shamed because in the Jewish mind it was important to preserve a family line. It's not so much in our world today. We're not as up on that, but it was very much important in the Jewish mind. And this was greatly linked to the inheritance. And so this was important, and the Redeemer concept. The third law that we want to look at before we get into this particular the chapter by chapter is the law of gleaning. The law of gleaning was designed by Moses sort of as a form of welfare. If I owned a field and according to Moses, my reapers could only go through the field once and only once. Whatever they missed the first time through was left for the widows, the destitute, the orphans, the poor. Strangers in the land could go out and glean in the fields, and whatever was dropped, they could pick up, and it helped feed them. And another area, if you think of a field as square, when they gleaned, they were not to go right to the end of the square. Let me get my hand here and go down. In fact, they were to curve and leave the corners standing for, again, the widows, the destitute, the orphans, the poor, those within it. And so you have these three important matters that we have, concepts, laws that helped govern the people. Let's look at chapter 1, and let's see what we can do here. And I'm going to try to make some moves here in some of my books, and give me just a moment here. It is quite interesting. A family from Bethlehem leaves for Moab in search of bread. Now, unless you know Hebrew, unless you know what the word Bethlehem really means, the parallel was lost. And so therefore, in the PowerPoint, I have included the house of bread. And that is important, the house of bread. Bethlehem is known as the house of bread. And Elimelech, his wife Naomi, his son Mahlon, and Chilion leave Bethlehem for Moab in search of bread. There was a famine on in Bethlehem, and he leaves. In fact, our textbook says that the house of bread had become the house of famine. And it's quite interesting that Elimelech goes to Moab. Why not to another tribe of Israel? Was the famine, and we're not told, was the famine widespread in Israel? Why not Egypt? Why not any of the other surrounding people? Why Moab? And again, probably out of, if you remember in our very first class, when we looked at the various surrounding people and the various countries in Canaan where the Joshua was to go in and conquer, Moab and Ammon were the most congenial to Israel, and probably out of the two, Moab was the more open to Israel, and so they go to Moab. It is interesting when you look at the very first one. Let's look at this, because very first verse is very important. And it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled. This dates the book of Ruth. It's in the judges period. As I've already stated, a lot of scholars believe that this happened during the time of Gideon. There was a famine in the land. And if it is during the time of Gideon, and we haven't had a chance to look at this, so let me just mention, if it was during the time of Gideon, there were foreigners coming in and was literally destroying the crop. That very well could have been part of the famine. But notice this next part. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Now, it's interesting to note that little word sojourn. Elimelech and Naomi did not go to Moab to stay for a long time. They went for a short time in hopes that the famine would be avoided, and the famine would be short-lived. They could come back and get on with their life. However, it is believed by scholars that they actually lived in Moab 10 years. They stayed longer than they planned to stay. While they were there, a lot of things happen in Moab. Elimelech dies. And I'm not sure that this happened first, but Mahlon and Chilion marry Moabite women. Now, this was forbidden, although it wasn't as forbidden, if I could put it this way, as if they would have married the Amalekites, the Egyptians, the Canaanites, the Philistines. That was looked upon as very, very bad. They were forbidden to marry Moabite people, but if they did, it was still wrong, but it wasn't judged as strongly, if I could put it that way, as it was for some of the other people. But here they married 2 Moabite women, Ruth, we know, and Orpha was the other daughter. And Elimelech dies. Now it's very interesting, and I didn't put this up, but Elimelech's name means God is my king. Naomi's name means pleasant, full. Mahlon's name, and as we read here, Mahlon and Chilion both were sickly children. Mahlon's name means unhealthy. Chilion's name means puny. Quite interesting, their names. Ruth's name means desirable and friendship. Orpah's name means neck. And so we have Naomi is in Moab. Her sons have married Moabite women, and Elimelech dies. Our textbook says this: can one still affirm that my God is king when Elimelech, my God is king, is dead? And the surviving spouse is a refuge, an alien, and a woman? That pain will exacerbate with the subsequent death of her two sons. A woman who was already a refuge, an alien, and a woman now, and a widow, now becomes childless as well. All that she has is her two daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth. Naomi gets word, and I have here, and Naomi's woes. Her husband dies, her children dies. Naomi hears in verse 6 that the famine is gone out of Bethlehem, and Naomi is ready to go back. She is tired of living in Moab. Her husband's dead, her children's dead. She's ready to return to familiar surroundings. And so Naomi sets off. She packs up her stuff. She moves. And they go for a while, and her daughter-in-laws go with Naomi. Now, in our culture, that is very different compared to what we think of today in our culture. Normally, mother-in-laws are not thought of very well, especially by the fellas. I can't help but think of a story that I heard back when I was where you're at in college, about a young girl that fell in love with this young man, and all the young man thought the girl was beautiful, and vice versa. Everything was wonderful, and oh man, it couldn't get any better, and things were just going great. But the mother-in-law felt it was her duty to be on every date that her daughter had. The very first date, the boyfriend didn't think too much of it, but when it began to be every date, he had some issues with it. But the mother-in-law said that this was her policy, and of course, because she was on the date, she was there when the young man proposed, and obviously she was there at the wedding. And as they were loading up the car to go on their honeymoon, the mother-in-law comes out of the house with her suitcases packed, and she insists that she's going on the honeymoon. There was no way of dissuading her, and so she gets into the car. She goes with the newlyweds to wherever they're at. One day, that morning, they woke up, and to they heard on the news that a lion had escaped the city zoo, and for people to be on the lookout for that lion. Well, that particular day, they had plans to just stroll through the city park. And so, sure enough, here was the newlyweds, arm in arm, Google-eyed at each other, saying sweet nothings and all of those wonderful things to each other. And behind them, at a safe distance, was the clip-clop of the feet of the mother-in-law as she tagged along behind. All of a sudden, there was an absolute horrible commotion behind. The newlyweds stop, turn around, and look. And there is that lion that had escaped from the zoo attacking, or what appeared to be attacking, the mother-in-law. I mean, there was hair and fur flying, and blood and slobber all over the place. And the young bride turns to her husband and says, "Oh, honey, do something, do something." To which the young husband, the new husband, looks at his young bride and says, "Honey, that lion got himself into that mess. He can get out the best way he can." Mother-in-laws are not thought of as very good around in our culture. But in this culture, once a daughter left their family, they stayed with their husband's family. That was just bottom line. You didn't do anything else but stay with the family. And so the two daughter-in-laws are following Naomi back to Bethlehem. Naomi realizes that they're really going to be a problem. Nobody in Israel is going to want to marry these Moabite women. And so she tells them to go back to their people. And she addresses this law of the brother-in-law. And she says, listen, I had 2 sons. You guys married them. I'm too old to get married again. And I'm too old to have children. And even if I could, would you wait until they're of age to marry? Go back to your home. Go back to your God. Go back to your family. Marry someone else. Have a family. And the daughter-in-laws weep. And they cry. And Orpah, she turns around and goes back to Moab. Not Ruth. She clings, the Bible says. She clings to Naomi. And in verse 14, and finally Naomi says, Ruth, your sister-in-law has gone back. Why don't you? And this is where Ruth entreats Naomi and says, she says to Naomi, I'm going to stay with you. Don't ask me to leave. I'm going to stay with you. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. Your God, my God. And where you die, I'm going to die. Now, a lot of times we use this passage at weddings, and rightfully so. But if you take it, a lot of times by doing so, we take it out of context. These words were said not to a husband. These words were said to a mother-in-law. Think about that, fellas. A mother-in-law. Ruth is saying, I want to commit my life, my love, my all to you, my mother-in-law. And you have given me my husband, though we've had no children. My responsibility is to take care of you. And a powerful statement. And we see here our textbooks say, let me just say here, in verses 8 and 9 of chapter 1, Naomi prays for her daughter-in-laws. She says, the Lord deal kindly with you, as ye have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant you that ye may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband. Little did Naomi understand how God was going to answer that prayer of Ruth's. And I wrote on the side of my textbook here, on the margin, I wrote this: do we always understand our prayers and the results of our prayers when we pray them? Think about that. Take notice of this, okay? And we see here that Naomi she stops talking to Ruth. Ruth says, don't do this. Naomi stops talking. Now, there's a lot of speculation here. Exactly what all was happening. Let me see if I can find it here. It's been a while since I've read this textbook for this. The response of Naomi, here we go on page 192, to Ruth at this point is, she said no more to her. Verse 18. Naomi's silence has been interpreted by some as Naomi's anger at Ruth, but more likely means that Naomi ceased trying to persuade Ruth not to go with her and consenting to have Ruth return with her. And consented, rather, to have Ruth return with her. Now, my feeling was that Naomi wasn't angry with Ruth, but I think Naomi, and this is the next point, Naomi had some thoughts about Ruth. Naomi may have thought that Ruth was going to be a burden to her. She was going to have to provide for Ruth. And she's going to have to try to find Ruth a husband. And she's a Moabitess. No one is going to want to marry her. She's going to be a burden on the already exhausted, poor, impoverished Naomi. Because when she comes back to Bethlehem, as we see here, notice verse 19. So the two went until they came to Bethlehem, and it came to pass when they were come to Bethlehem that all the city was moved about them, and they said, "Is this Naomi?" And if you continue to read, nowhere in Scripture does Naomi introduce Ruth. She very well could have, but it's not mentioned in Scripture. So we have here Naomi. Now notice what she says. Verse 20, Naomi says, "Call me not Naomi, pleasant, fool. For the Almighty hath dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord hath brought me home again empty. Why then call ye me Naomi, seeing the Lord hath testified against me, and the Almighty hath afflicted me?" She says, "Call me not Naomi, call me Mara," which means bitter. Here Naomi is saying, call me the bitter one, because God has dealt bitterly with me. Naomi is making the mistake of many loyal and hurting believers today, interpreting and trying to figure out God in the light of our circumstances. God doesn't like me because I'm having bad circumstances. God is not in favor of me because I'm having problems. That is trying to figure out God in light of our circumstances. Rather, we ought to interpret and try to figure out our circumstances in light of God and His character. Last year, the choir sang a song called "Blessing" by Laura Story. And in that, she basically says the same thing. If we're not careful, we'll say, God doesn't like me because of what God has done to me. But no, we need to look at it and say, this has happened because God is a loving God, and God has allowed this to happen. Normally in Scripture, let me just point this out, and let me move on to this, because normally when there's been a name change in the Bible, it's always been positive. Jacob to Israel, Abram to Abraham, and the list goes on. Simon to Peter, all have been positive. But Naomi's is the opposite. Pleasant. and now I'm bitter. So far for Naomi, our textbook says Ruth has not done what Naomi wanted, to go back to her people. And now God has done what Naomi did not want him to do. And so Naomi's thinking about it. Here I'm back in Bethlehem. I thought I would be happy, but seeing all of the happiness in Bethlehem has even made me more bitter. And I have a Moabite daughter-in-law that I've got to take care of. My life is very, very bitter. Somewhere in Naomi's life in Bethlehem, or in Moab, she spoke very highly of God because it drew Ruth. Now she comes back to Bethlehem, and Ruth is hearing Naomi say, God has embittered me. And so we see chapter 2. Notice with me chapter 2. And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a mighty man of wealth, and of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. This statement is just sort of to give a small introduction of what's going to happen in the next 3 chapters. Naomi is not even thinking of Boaz. All Naomi can think of is her bitterness and what has happened. And she is just beside herself. She's angry. She's upset. God has even furthered her punishment, so to speak, by sending Ruth back to her. And I have down in the bottom of the page that this is key. Remember how Naomi was trying to interpret God out of her circumstances instead of interpreting her circumstances in light of God and his character? Naomi didn't think Ruth was a blessing from God. However, Ruth turned out to be Naomi's greatest blessing. Naomi goes back. Notice verse 2 there. And Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, let me go to the field and glean ears of corn after him, in whose sight I shall find grace. Verse 3, or still verse 2, and she said unto her, go, my daughter. Now, because Naomi says, I'm not able to have kids, we think that she was 70 years old, she's 80 years old, she's struggling. No, she was probably somewhere, maybe in her 40s, maybe in her 50s. She had the strength to make the long journey back. She could have very well have gone out and gleaned. She was physically able to do so. But her mindset had so impaired her that she wanted to do nothing. This sounds like depression, doesn't it? I'm staying at home. I'm depressed. God has dealt bitterly with me. My husband's dead. My 2 sons are dead. I have this Moabite daughter-in-law that now I've got to take care of. My land is gone. My money is gone. I don't know where my food's coming from. I've got to prepare for Ruth. I'm embittered. And she's doing nothing. I want to tell you what, Ruth is an outstanding person because Ruth says, I'm going to go out and glean. We've got to eat. And so she goes out. And just by happenstance, coincidence, she goes to Boaz's field. Right? Wrong. God was directing Ruth's every step. She goes to the field of Boaz. Who is Boaz? Go back to verse 1 of chapter 2. He is a mighty man of wealth, and he is a kinsman. If you want to underline kinsman in the King James, everywhere that word kinsman is, it means redeemer. He is a redeemer. And Ruth begins to glean in the fields of Boaz and works hard. I'm telling you, regardless of who you are, if you serve God, God directs your path. And Boaz comes to see how the reaping is going in his field. And he notices Ruth. And he says, whose young lady is this? Notice there, and he says, whose damsel is this? Now, our textbook points out that he didn't say to Ruth, who are you? He says, whose are you? You know, he didn't say, who is this young damsel? Who does this young damsel belong to? She had to be, and the Bible doesn't say that she was an outstandingly beautiful lady, but her demeanor, everything about her, showed forth a godly spirit, and it attracted Boaz. And he says, whose wife is this? Whose daughter is this? She belongs to somebody. And the supervisor of the field says, oh, this is the young Moabitess, Ruth, that came back with Naomi. Boaz has already heard, as we will see later, of Ruth and what she has done for Naomi. Let me put this up, because Boaz takes notice of Ruth. He goes to Naomi and Ruth. He says, Ruth, I want you to stay close to my young women. And I have instructed the young men not to touch you, to bother you. Now, this word touch, as the King James, I believe, has it here, that they shall not touch thee, that word means to strike, to hit her, to touch her. And, you know, sometimes they could be mean to foreigners, so they would hit them. But sometimes some of the young men, and again, this is an indication that Ruth at least was a nice looking young lady, because the other word touch can mean to touch in a sensual, sexual touch. And so Boaz told his young man, you dare not touch Ruth in any fashion. And he tells Ruth, I have heard about your kindness, that you've gone the extra mile with Naomi, and I want you to glean with my reapers. And when you're thirsty, you go to the water bucket and you drink. Foreigners were not allowed to do that. Strangers were not allowed. But he said, I want you to. And in fact, it's interesting, up to this point in Scripture, there is no record that Boaz and Ruth talked since Boaz and Naomi had not talked since Naomi came back from Bethlehem. But Boaz knew all about Naomi and what had transpired. The source is not given. In fact, through the whole book of Ruth, up until the very last chapter, then there's conversation up to this point of Boaz in chapter 4 going to the gate to buy the land of Naomi. There's no indication that Boaz ever talked to Ruth or to Naomi in Scripture. I'm sure they did, but it doesn't say. And it's interesting. In verses 8 through 11, our textbook calls it a prayer, that when Boaz sees Ruth, he prays for her. And again, Naomi had lived God out and so given a desire for Ruth to turn to God. And then when she gets back to Bethlehem, she says, God has bittered me. And so God has been a kind God, a blessing God. And now Ruth says, boy, he's an embittering God. Void create a harsh, calamity bringing deity. But with, Boaz's prayer, she hears that God is a rewarding God. Boy, for a young lady trying to figure out who God is, there is all kinds of mixed signals here. But Ruth has a desire. And Boaz is saying, may God fully reward you. Notice verse 12, the Lord recompense thy work, and a full reward be given thee of the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings thou art come to trust. One wonders if Boaz knows, or maybe he is hoping that he himself will be the reward Yahweh will supply. Toward the end of the day, they have a meal, and Boaz asks Ruth to come and join the workers at the table to dip her bread. He gives her bread to dip her bread in the wine and to eat. And at the end of that meal, Boaz instructs his workers, I want you to, on purpose, to drop handfuls of grain for Ruth to pick up. She, our textbook, and I'm not going to get into it because I want to finish this up and make this recording not too awfully long. But our textbook gives the similarity of Abraham and Ruth. Abraham is said to go to a land that I will show you, but Ruth chooses to go to a land that she knows nothing and to follow God. It's quite an interesting comparison there. She comes back that night, and when she has beaten out what she has brought, she's brought out, she has quite a bit of grain. Plus she saved some of the food that Boaz had given to her. And she goes home, and let me see if I can find it here. She had an ephah of barley, and she brings it back, and Naomi says, blessed is the man to whose field you gleaned. Who is it? And Ruth said, the man's name was Boaz. And Naomi tells her in verse 20, the man is a near kinsman of mine. One of our next of kinsmen. There was another one. And she says, Ruth, you stay in Boaz's field. Don't go to anybody else, because if you do, the young men might hurt you because you are a foreigner. And so for the rest of the barley harvest, we see it in the few short verses at the end of chapter 2, Ruth stays in Boaz's field to glean. And it is quite interesting, this word kinsman, that we see here. Naomi relates to Ruth who Boaz is to them. He's a kinsman, a redeemer. Remember the law of the redeemer, the Goel, appears 22 times in the book of Ruth. And it appears 11 times in chapters 3 and 4 of those 22 times. And it is very interesting. At the end of the barley harvest, Naomi in chapter 3 says, I need to do something for you. I need to seek rest for thee, that it may be well with thee. Now remember, Naomi is not too excited, okay, about Ruth being with her. But Ruth has been a blessing. She has kept them alive. When Naomi was so depressed and embittered that she was doing nothing, Ruth kept them alive. And now Naomi feels an obligation to Ruth. And she says, let's see what we can do here. And as all good mother-in-laws do, or mothers, they are great matchmakers. And so she says, it is now threshing time. The grain has been harvested. It's been brought to the threshing floor. And I'm not going to go into this. Our textbook does, and you are to read the textbook so you will get it. But along with the city gate, the threshing floor was also a place for transactions to be taken place. And so we have here that this taking place. And so she goes down to the threshing floor, and Ruth does some strange things. And she observes where Boaz is laying, and he goes to sleep. Now, Boaz is probably at the threshing floor for two reasons. He's there to celebrate the great harvest, and he's there for also sort of as a way of protecting. However, in his protecting, he falls sound asleep. Boaz comes over, uncovers his feet, and lays down at his feet. During the night, Boaz turns over and realizes his feet is uncovered. He raises up to cover his feet, and there's a woman. And he says, "Who are you?" And Ruth tells who she is. And it's very interesting. And Ruth answers in verse 9, "I am Ruth, thy handmaid. Spread therefore thy skirt over thine handmaid, for thou art a near kinsman." This is interesting, and I want to hurry, and I'm just about done, but let me point out with this. Ruth was mixing the law of the brother-in-law and the law of the Redeemer together. Now, as I said, they're very closely related, but Boaz could have redeemed Naomi's land without being the brother-in-law. All right? But Ruth bunches them together, and she says, "You are a redeemer. Spread your, how was it again? Spread your garment, thy skirt over thy handmaid." In Scripture, this very reference always means to marriage. Boaz doesn't chide her and says, no, Ruth. No, what? Wait. I am a redeemer and I redeem land, but I do not have to marry you. He doesn't see that. He doesn't say that. And he accepts that he should also follow the law of the brother-in-law and also marry Ruth. And he tells her, "You lie down, and I will take care of this matter in the morning." Now it's quite interesting as our textbook points out, and we're just about done. So let me point out this interesting fact. That if it is according to ancient Eastern traditions and procedures, Naomi, they said, was probably married in her early to mid-teens, maybe 15 years old. And she had her two sons by the time she was 20. They, in turn, would have married by the time that they were 15 or so, to girls a bit younger. 10 years of childless marriage for them would bring us to the mid-40s for Naomi. Naomi was younger than me. Given the rigors of life in ancient Palestine, that would be years enough, almost certainly, to have Naomi reach menopause, which then would forbid her or forfeit her from having any more children. What is interesting, one could assume, they said, that Ruth was then between 25 to 30 years old. Boaz was probably somewhere in his mid-40s. Definitely mid-30s to mid-40s. And quite interesting. And so Boaz covers Ruth. She lays there. Now, some people have speculated, yeah, you can't tell me that Ruth and Boaz didn't do anything that night. He probably had a sexual encounter with her. I can't prove that. Let me put this back up here. I can't prove that, but Boaz says to Ruth in chapter 3 that there is a nearer kinsman than I, and I need to see what his intent is. If there was any possibility that that other kinsman would have redeemed Naomi's land and married Ruth, it would have been absolutely stupidity of Boaz to have any type of sexual relationship with Ruth that night in the threshing floor. I don't think anything happened. It was the highest integrity of morals. The night was well spent when Boaz awakened and realized Ruth was there. Ruth gets up early in the morning. It makes me wonder, did Ruth even go to sleep at all that night? She gets up early in the morning while it's still dark and you can't really distinguish who is who. And she gets ready to leave. And Boaz says, you cannot leave without a gift for Naomi. And I have that here. And so Boaz gives a gift to Naomi, and he promises Ruth that I will deal with this matter in the morning. And it was funny because at the end of chapter 3, she comes home to Naomi, and Naomi says, sit still, my daughter, until thou knowest how the matter will fall, for the man will not be in rest until he have finished the thing this day. Naomi is now beginning to really get involved with this love life of Boaz and Ruth. And she must have known that Boaz was interested in Ruth, very much so. And she knew Boaz would go. And so we see in chapter 4, as we come to the end here, that Boaz goes to the city gate and he gathers 10 men that were rulers of the city, and they wait and they talk about what needs to be done for Boaz to redeem Naomi's land and marry Ruth. And again, we don't know if they had sent word out to this other nearer kinsman or if he happened to come by the gate, but he shows up and Boaz calls him over. Now it's interesting that Boaz introduces him as friend, doesn't call him by name. Whether Boaz called him by name and the writers of the gospel because he turned down the redemption, he's not worthy to have his name mentioned, because this word friend would be the equivalent of saying John Doe. We don't know the name, so it's John Doe or Mr. So-and-so. We're not giving a name. And Boaz begins to say that Naomi is selling her property, and wants to know if this near kinsman would like to purchase Naomi's property. The man is very much interested in being the redeemer of the property. In fact, he says, absolutely, I will redeem it. Verse 4. Verse 5, and as I love this as I read this, Boaz is slick. He is a slick seller. He presents the property. The man bites, and then Boaz says, oh, and by the way, when you redeem the property, you have to marry Ruth. The man says, I cannot redeem it. I cannot mar my own inheritance. I am a real Israelite. I will not marry a foreigner. And he says, I cannot redeem it. That word in the Hebrew simply means I am unwilling to do it. Wasn't that he couldn't. He had the means. He was willing to buy the land. But he says, I am unwilling. I do not want to damage my own inheritance. I like what our textbook says. In whatever way taking Ruth would damage this man's own inheritance, this unnamed man marks himself as dramatically different from Ruth in their respective scales of value. For Ruth, loyalty stands head and shoulders over everything else. For this person, loyalty is expendable, especially when it means sacrifice. By this time, there's more than 12 people, because the Bible says there is a crowd that now gathers to witness this transaction. And as it is true to custom, in this transaction, they were to take off a shoe and give it to the others. And that was what happened. The man takes off his sandal, gives it to Boaz, not to keep, but as a means of, I am giving my right to redeem to you. And when this happens, Boaz says, I will marry Ruth and I will redeem Naomi's property. The crowd then begins to pronounce a blessing upon Boaz. And the blessing is in two means. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah. Through Rachel and Leah, there were 12 sons born to Jacob. Israel, his name was changed. Howbeit, Rachel's handmaid and Leah's handmaid was given to Jacob as wives, but it was still through Rachel and Leah, 12 sons were given. So they're saying, may you be fruitful and have many sons. The second point is very interesting. And it's simply this. And let me make sure I have it here. And let thy house, verse 12 of chapter 4, be like the house of Pharez, whom Tamar bare unto Judah, of the seed which the Lord shall give thee of this young woman. Tamar. Do you remember the story of Tamar and Judah? Tamar is Judah's daughter-in-law. Her husband dies. There's been no children raised up to her. And as Judah's other boys grow old, he doesn't give them Tamar to them. He leaves her alone. Finally realizing this law of brotherhood, Tamar plays the harlot and goes into her father-in-law Judah. And he bears a son through his own daughter-in-law. Quite interesting because, again, we have this story of why a blessing out of a very bad act. And we see here that Boaz redeems Naomi's land and marries Ruth. Naomi is restored. I'm just about done, and there's so much more that I want to give. I wish we could go into it. But the people name, when Ruth has a child, that they name it Obed. And they come around, and the people are praising Naomi. And it's interesting here as you look in the end of this, and I'm trying to find it here in verses, verse 13, Boaz took Ruth, and she was his wife. And when he went in unto her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bare a son. And the women said unto Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, which hath not left thee this day without a kinsman, that his name may be famous in Israel. And he shall be unto thee a restorer of thy life, and a nourisher of thine own age. For thy daughter-in-law, they don't even mention Ruth's name, but thy daughter-in-law, which loveth thee, which is better to thee than 7 sons, hath borne him. Ruth is identified by name, but by relation, not name, but by relation, daughter-in-law, by her affection for Naomi, and by her worth to Naomi. She is more to thee than 7 sons. Of this phrase, Campbell states, what more appropriate way to praise Ruth than to say she is worth 7 times what the story has made such an absorbing concern, a son. So Boaz becomes redeemer, husband, and father. Naomi becomes grandmother, and by the law of the brother-in-law, legal mother, foster mother, and nanny to Obed. From Boaz comes Obed. From Obed, Jesse. From Jesse, King David. There is 2 other items that I want to talk about that as I end this time. In Deuteronomy 23 and verse 3, the Bible states that no Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. If a Hebrew marries an Ammonite or a Moabite, they were not allowed into the temple to properly worship God for 10 generations. We know that David was in the temple, right? How was this? How was it so? It is interesting to note that in one of the Talmuds, um, the rabbis' writings on the Jewish law, it was indicated that this law found in Deuteronomy 23:3 was only for a male, not a female. So in other words, if a Jewish woman married an Ammonite man or a Moabite man, then their descendants were forbidden. But if a Jewish man married a Ammonite or Moabite woman, then that law did not apply. That would make sense in the fact that David was very much involved in the worship of God and involved in the temple and the tabernacle. Let me finish up with one more thought here, and that is Matthew's genealogy. It's very interesting in Matthew's gospel, in Matthew chapter 1, that Matthew lists 5 women in the genealogies. The very first one that was mentioned was Rahab. The second one, the very first one mentioned was Tamar, the daughter-in-law of Judah. The second one was Rahab. The third one was Ruth. The fourth one was Bathsheba. All 4 of those ladies, all 4 of them, were known to be wicked women in a lot of ways. Tamar played the harlot with her own father-in-law. Rahab was a harlot, but she hid the spies. Ruth was a Moabitess. It doesn't say that she was immoral like the other 2 and Bathsheba, but Ruth was a Moabitess. And they would sacrifice to their god Moloch children. They would burn the idol until it was bright red, and then take babies and children and throw it into the hot iron of the idol and hot metal of the idol until it would kill the babies. It was a wicked people. Ruth was a Moabitess. Bathsheba was the wife of David, of whom he had an immoral affair before she became his wife. Of course, obviously, the 5th woman is Mary, one that a lot of people looked upon her when she was expecting Jesus as being an immoral person. Even though the scripture said it would happen, she was still considered to be immoral. It is quite interesting as you look through this, and when you really understand it. Why was Boaz not afraid to marry Ruth? Well, if you really want to know the story, or as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story, Boaz's mother was Rahab, the harlot. Obviously, he had no problems marrying Ruth, the Moabitess. And he did so. And God blessed Boaz and Ruth's marriage. And so today we're going to conclude our study of Ruth. I hope this has been beneficial. I hope it's been helpful. And we will see what happens here, and trying to get this uploaded. Thank you so much. We'll see you next Tuesday evening as we look into the book of Judges.